cover today. All right, everyone, welcome to the webinar today. Not a webinar for once, it's a panel discussion, right? Aren't we all done with webinar fatigue over this last year? Right. So today we've got three great panelists from three very different institutions, and we're talking about a very interesting topic as well. I've got Michael Smullen, the Executive Director at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. There's Barney Ellis Perry, who is the Associate Vice Chancellor at Vanderbilt University, and Mike Fedeli, the Chief Advancement Officer at Juniper-Serra High School in San Francisco. So it's three very different schools at different sides of the spectrum, and we can't wait to get started. There's a lot of room to cover, but just quick logistics, because we have been doing this for a while, but there might be a few people who are not used to the webinar culture, right? So everyone's on mute, but you can ask your questions in chat and we'll try and get back to you. I'll try and interject questions in between to the panelists as well, but we'll try and take questions towards the end. The whole session is being recorded. We'll send you a recording as a follow-up to the webinar, but that's pretty much it. Enjoy the conversation, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask, because this is an evolving space and it's about all of us coming together to try and figure out how to evolve the space in this industry, right? I'll start sharing my screen, and we are using some slides as reference, but really it's just a visual cue. This is more about the conversation. Whatever you see on the slides is just a cue for what we're talking about at that time, so you don't necessarily need to make notes. But here we are, let's get started. And before we do, I just wanted to talk about how we got here, right? Like, why are we doing this webinar? How did we arrive at talking about engagement metrics, right? And we at Alumni Base also, we've been having conversations with several people in the industry, especially over the last couple of years. And the truth is, the state of alumni engagement metrics today is that most schools still measure participation on events, participation on giving, and how their communications is performing, right? Your email open rates, your click rates, and whatnot. But there's so much more that's happening that is engagement, and there's so much more beyond just the constituents that you're looking at, and there's so much that you're not seeing that you're missing out on, right? And we cannot improve what we don't measure, but we are stuck measuring just the same things that we have always been. And the challenge, honestly, is that there are several siloed tools that everybody is using, and siloed tools increases the work across offices, because you don't talk to each other. It's not an integrated team anymore, and the more tools you have, the more work you need to do to move things between them, right? And that's why a lot of people hesitate to measure things beyond this, but technology has evolved to a point where a lot of this can be simplified or automated, right? And we have learnings from across the spectrum. And an argument we often hear is that something that's true for a K through 12 might not be true for a higher ed, and vice versa. But what we've realized is that there are so many more similarities than differences, right? So let's try and focus on our similarities across the board and learn from that and see what we could implement out of this, rather than focus on our differences. And that's what we'll try and do, right? So the format for today is that Mike Fedeli is from Serra High, and he represents like a K through 12, the challenges that K through 12 might have. And Michael Smullen's from NJIT, which is the larger college. And Barney's at Vanderbilt, which is a large university, right? So there's all the way across the spectrum, there's different challenges we're facing. And we'll talk about that, and we'll try to see what we can learn from what each of us have learned in our own roles, right? To start with, we wanted to talk about getting started, right? So to start with engagement, you need to measure, and what are you measuring is the first bit, right? So Mike, let's start with you, right? I know it's Sarah that you mentioned you were working on a strategic plan. You wanted to identify 10 specific areas that you wanted to focus on as an organization, right? Could you talk about how you narrowed it down to these 10 specific areas that you wanted to measure engagement on?
Sure. Thanks, Jishan, and welcome everybody. My name is Mike Fedeli. I'm with Juniper-Serra High School here in San Mateo, California. We are an all-boys Catholic high school. I'm a graduate. I graduated several years ago in 1988. I have had a son that's gone through here that graduated last year. I have a son who is a current freshman. So this institution is very close to my heart. I spent 20 years in radio sales before I got into the advancement world, and this is the start of my fourth year. So it's still a learning phase for me. And when I was hired by an outgoing president, and we've had a new president who stepped in, and about 4 months into his tenure, we were hit with COVID. So A lot of change happening here. We're a relatively small advancement department, myself and a few other folks. So for us, it's all about putting systems into place where we are able to measure. And one of the things that we are doing as an institution, we actually were going into, we're about a month away from finalizing our strategic plan here at Sarah for the next 5 years. And so that process began pre-pandemic, and we were finally able to come together this past May for a strategic planning retreat. And what we did is we broke out into specific domains for advancement and other areas. And then what we did was we came up with a strategic goal. So I just want to share this goal with you because it really kind of talks about, why we're doing this. So we in advancement will continue to develop a culture of philanthropy to build upon and strengthen lifelong relationships through better engagement. And that's the key term there, to create a sustainable source of funds to ensure the vitality of our school now and for generations to come. And as Jishin mentioned, when you do the strategic plan, you come up with all these, different objectives. And we, probably could have had 50, as you go through the process. We created 10, but from there we wanted to narrow that down. And, they range from, increasing our endowment to launching a major capital campaign, to communicating more effectively with our constituents. But one that really stood out to us was to build a more robust alumni program. So, as we narrowed it down, we wanted to focus on being an engaged community of support and have a strong financial plan to succeed. And part of that is, with our alumni and developing a plan to be able to do that. So we are in the midst right now of building a more robust alumni program. We've got a rich history, 75 years strong. But what I noticed when I came on board is that, we had connections with a lot of folks, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and that connection, not so much with alums that graduated in 2000 and beyond. So our focus right now is to really be able to connect with those younger alums, as we call them, and stay connected with them. So we're in the process of building out our plan, but using KPIs are really important in how we are going to measure our success going forward.
Sorry, guys, I was on mute. Thank you, Mike.
That's okay.
So happens to the best, right?
We've all done that.
Right. So what I was saying, Michael, was that with NJIT, you also crafted your metrics program such that it ties to institutional objectives, right? Outcomes like financial assistance or mentoring, or maybe even increasing the visibility of alumni in the community and so on. Could you talk us through a little about the earlier days, right? So where you went from crafting outcomes to trying to actually tie those outcomes to metrics and then to goals. You started with a proof of concept, right? So that might be the first step. So could you talk to us about that when you went from outcomes to metrics to goals and
Sure.
proof of concept?
So thanks very much for having me, and big thanks to my fellow panelists. I'm pleased to be here with you. So I've been working in alumni development for about 20 years now, at smaller liberal arts places, at larger state places. And in the last 10 years, I've worked at Polytechs, Stevens Institute of Technology and New Jersey Institute of Technology. So the entire duration, what I've seen is this dramatic transformation in the industry. Alumni relations as a facet of development in alumni tended to be sort of a supporting role. It wasn't necessarily its own profession. That's changed drastically, largely in response to the amount of data that's coming in and how to translate that into action. So I've seen this happen over the last 20 years. And over the last 10, particularly because I was working at Polytechs, our alumni associations are very interested in data, knowing the data, knowing the quality of data, and then making decisions based on that data. Of course, that would naturally fall underneath the rubric of how do you support your strategic plan. So I was first interested in coming up with an engagement benchmark of some type at Stevens and trying to really quantify the success or lack thereof, or the areas of interest that would generate. So I pulled together the baseline elements of any good alumni program, right? So you have to have events, communications, volunteer management, and ultimately donations. There's different ways of measuring those things. There's different ways of describing them, but those are the general buckets. So when you look at that, each one of those has its own element. How many people are attending events? Really, how many alumni are attending events? Do we have good quality communication with those people? So do we have good employment information, contact information, and so on, contactability? Volunteerism takes many forms, but generally you can look at any board that's tracked, if it's tracked, and if it's not tracked, you should. And then finally, at the top of the pyramid, support. Support is not just financial, but clearly financial is a big driver for this. So when you have that sort of clarity, you're able to pull those numbers together if you possess them. So at Stevens, I did a lot of this manually, and I pulled it together. You said proof of concept, so I pulled it together into like an 8 or 9 megabyte Excel document, and did a lot of VLOOKing up and comparison, and then sort of ranked what was what. And that was a guidepost for me. So what I was able to do from there was identify pockets of alumni engagement that I was missing, and areas where I thought we were weak, but we needed to get stronger. But that was very draft times. And at the time, so this would have been around 2011, I was looking for companies that would do things for us, the sort of analysis. It tended to be extremely expensive if they did it, and it was more of a holistic approach, very donor-centric. And the thing with just focusing on donations is you miss so many of these other elements that really generate pride and engagement. So with that having been said, when I came to NJIT, I was able to work much more closely with this, working with my vice president, who was very interested in these metrics. We agreed to a set standard, we agreed to a set scoring model, and we now do it on a very consistent basis, on a quarterly basis, in fact. That tells us, and this is not only in my goals, but it's also in his reports to our overseers and our trustees, it indicates to us where our engagement is. Finally, as a last piece on that, even that has changed drastically in the last year. So with the advent of COVID, the pandemic, our engagement numbers have had to expand dramatically beyond simple event attendance. Clearly, we didn't have a lot of people, particularly in New Jersey, coming out to physical events. But there's so many other ways that people were interacting. That's allowed me to start expanding the engagement tracking that we do in a way that's more accurately reflective of what alumni perceive and how they view engagement with their university.
Very interesting, Michael. And this is similar in a sense to what CASE has been advocating over the last couple of years with their engagement metrics pillars as well, right? And what we've seen as well is that CASE's broad metrics might be a good way for smaller schools to get started with measuring engagement, right? There's experiential, volunteering, philanthropic, and communication, and then you drill down to what that means for your organization, right? And it's interesting to see that how you've expanded on that. Barney, for you, I understand you're in the middle of a much larger shift, right? Like from looking at alumni relations or annual giving as separate functions to a more integrated approach, putting the constituent at the center, right? And I imagine that means different things for what you measure as well, right? What are you looking at differently that you weren't looking at before when it was less of an integrated office? And how has that changed for you?
Thank you, kind sir. Yeah, there's a lot of changes going on here. Similar to Mike, we have new leadership and a new chancellor. So lots going on and a whole bunch of things. So firstly, looking at a new model. So when we talk about engagement, we're actually talking about engagement of our alumni, our parents, our friends in the community, of faculty and staff, et cetera. So we're taking the sort of the magic skills of alumni relations, if you will, and spreading those over our other key constituents. I think I left out parents. So we want to measure the engagement of all of those folks. Similar to Mike as well, we're building a system. So there had been a draft metrics program put together. We have an amazingly smart person called Caroline Johnson who's been doing that, but it was never actually implemented. So now under our new strategic plan and our move to Salesforce, we're implementing that. So it's great. We're following the case buckets like you wisely mentioned. And we are building this into our system so that when our development officers and our engagement officers open up Salesforce, look at a prospect, what they will see is their engagement score. at the top. So that right away, because one of the things I've always noticed is people don't use the engagement data in relation to fundraising as much as I think they could. So we're really have that like boom, right when you open it up. So that's really exciting. We're also building our program so that we're measuring, we're doing the breadth. So all outputs, everything that people are doing, which is sort of the preliminary case, the case buckets, attending events and, opening the magazine, all those good things. But we're really focusing on outcome measurements. So we're going for the depth as well. So what is it that people are doing that lift the mission? And so like, both of the folks on the call here, as mentioned, they're focusing on here's our strategy for institutionally and how are we lifting that. So I want to be able to draw a thread from what people are doing over to the institutional strategic plan. So for example, for us, yield in admissions is a really big focus for us. We want to move up, in our yield numbers. So anything that a parent, an alumnus, a staff member does as, in the space that helps our yield number, that's an outcome. So that's what we're really focused on. So it's really exciting. We had traditionally been we knew our number of alumni who were involved. We knew that. We're 22% last year, et cetera. But we didn't have any of the depth of it. And we only had the information that was in our purview within development alumni relations. And so now we're looking at across the institution, and we know that's a very heavy lift. It's not going to happen overnight. But we need to get that data because we need to know what they're doing all over the place. Because no matter what the size of your institution or organization is, you need to know what the left and the right hand are doing because our constituents only see one institution. For us, they only see one Vanderbilt. They don't care about the hundreds of departments and all that stuff. They have one relationship with us, and that's how they see us. And so our whole new plan is all about implementation of technology and using artificial intelligence ethically to drive information to folks and give them that singular personal engagement with the institution.
Absolutely. And it does, right? And that's the challenge, right? Taking this theory and trying to implement it. And it's always the first step that's complicated, right? The end goal is perhaps a lot clearer than what the first 5 steps are. And that's the next bit that I wanted to get to as well, right? But it is interesting that you mention outcomes because what we're learning on our end also is that an outcome-based measurement system or an outcome-based engagement metrics program works regardless of what size your organization is, right? And one of the things we've been working on our end is this tool that we call Engagement Studio, right? So it's essentially something that brings together engagement across all of your channels, right? There's events, there's giving, but there might be even things like, you met someone at a coffee shop or someone spoke to a professor, attended a football game, and that's engagement too, right? Now, how do you tie together the outcomes that these engagements are driving, right? So maybe you want to try and measure how much of an outcome towards admissions, like you said, Barney, might be driven by certain engagement activities, right? And Michael, you might be measuring things about visibility, right? And Mike, you might be talking about just consistency of relationships with, your alumni, right? And there are different outcomes you're trying to drive. And the idea with Engagement Studio has also been to try and surface those things out, right? So you track all the engagements that's happening, whether it's events or giving, or even like I said, met at a coffee shop, and you take all that information and then you are able to act on it, right? So you find segments of people who have engaged with you in different ways, maybe people who engage with you in email, but don't make a gift, don't turn up for your events, right? Let's try and build a separate automation plan to try and engage these guys, right? So that's the idea broadly, but at the end of the day, it's still about just an outcome-based engagement measurement system. So and that works across the board, right? So you might have smaller outcomes to start off with, and then you build metrics, and then you build Lego blocks on top of it, and you go from there. So but like you said, it's only as whatever you measure and whatever you look at is only as good as how you use those metrics, and how you prioritize how to use those metrics, right? So let's maybe talk about bringing focus to this, right? How do you prioritize what you want to measure as an organization out of the metrics that you're looking at, right? So Mike, let's start with you, right? Out of all these 10 outcomes, it's of course impossible to make progress on all 10 at once, like you said. Which areas are you most focused on now, and what led you to prioritize those areas?
Well, what Barney said, I take to heart too, because I mean, I know we're talking about, alumni centric, engagement, but it's really engagement with all our constituents here. And so, when we put together the strategic plan, and to your point, I mean, you can't look at all 10 outcomes. You just don't have the resources to be able to do that. And if you try to do it, then you're going to fail. You're going to be maybe average at all instead of graded a few. So for us, really where we wanted to prioritize, at least initially, and what it is that we're trying to build right now is with our alumni, as I mentioned earlier before. 13,000 alumni strong. Some of them are people that, are really famous, and including the quarterback of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who's the winningest Super Bowl quarterback of all times. He's a graduate of Sarah High School. The all-time home run leader in Major League Baseball is a graduate of Sarah High School. So we have a really robust alumni group. And so for me in this department, it's really to focus on that group. And I think the biggest thing for us too, and what we're trying to do right now, is to understand how they want to be communicated with, understand how they want to engage with Sarah. There's so many different ways in which you can do that. And Jishin, I think you said it when, it's at games, it's at coffee shops. I mean, one of the things that we're really trying to do is bring alumni back in different ways. So it's not always for an ask. It's if this person has a strong skill set and can be a speaker in a speaker series that we've created, we want him to come back, whether that's to be able to talk to the students here and talk to the alumni and do different things. We've done some stuff recently where, we posted internships and job opportunities. And those are the things that seem to, engage our alumni, where they can communicate back and forth with one another. So we're really trying to focus our efforts right now on that robust alumni program that offers the multiple opportunities for engagements and, engagement. And it's not just events, and not just donations. It's those other things that allow you to specifically develop, those strong relationships moving forward.
Exactly. And I think an interesting challenge with that is also that how do you measure whether that engagement is effective, right? And Michael, I'd love it if you could talk about this a little bit, because I've heard you say that what activities to measure is about looking at the metrics that you can impact as a team, right? And for engagement measurement, that might mean that you sometimes put things behind a gate, right? Like Mike was saying, if you're trying to offer, job opportunities or internship opportunities to young alumni, is that something you put behind a gate because you want to measure that specifically? But that applies to every program that you're rolling out, right? Like, how do you decide what programs to put behind a gate and what not to?
So a lot of that, first of all, I love what my fellow panelists are saying here. And I love the notion that, alumni are part of that community as a whole that you connect with, because as you mentioned, impact, well, that is a place where alumni, parents, whatever, they're part of the community of the school. And alumni, pretty much from the start to the finish of a university, a college, or a high school, they're almost always going to be the largest single group of constituents that an organization has, because over time you're graduating more. So with that in mind, you're absolutely right that tracking those things is important. Well, in fact, it's necessary. If you're not tracking it, then it's not something you can necessarily report on. Now, that's not always going to be the case. Relationships are so much a part of what we do. And one of the wonderful things about this profession is personal relationships count towards so much, and you can never quantify the entirety of that. But the elements of it, you can certainly do. So first off, tracking things, and again, these will be some tangibles to the audience. Tracking things that are necessary to have an understanding of the relationship. So first off, certainly event attendance, invited but not attended, donor, non-donor, ever giver, somebody who's given historically in the past but not recently, libunts, sibunts, and so on. More than that, so volunteerism, committee support, but also one-off volunteerism. So what I have found is a dramatic shift, particularly in the last 2 years, where alumni are more interested in signing up for a tangible one-off volunteer opportunity rather than being part of a committee, which they see as a large demand on their time and they're concerned about committing to. So a lot of this is flexibility with regards to changing demographics and changing timeframes and so on. When we talk about putting it behind the wall, so I'll use as an example, in the last 2 years, again, since the advent of COVID, we had switched over to a predominantly virtual events shop. We had to bring ourselves up to speed and train ourselves in all the software, but ultimately it led to a question of how do you prove that people are viewing? So of course, YouTube gives you views and it gives you demographics. LinkedIn can do much the same, Facebook can do much the same, but it doesn't tell you who and who is important. So I was able to work with a company where I was able to put our videos, both post and live streaming, behind a first name, last name, email gateway that allowed me to track. The downside is, by nature, that is going to reduce people who want to view it for 5 minutes and pop in, see if it's interesting and jump off. So there is a balance that needs to be struck. What I found was in the initial live stream of events, I preferred to make it as openly available as possible on as many channels as possible. Knowing that it was quality content actually built up a little bit of buzz. Then putting it behind that gateway allowed me to then re-promote it. So the great thing about the modern day is that you can reuse content a lot. You can chop it up. You can do different pieces that are of interest to people. And that allowed us to do that much more. So there's a lot of interest in campus transformation here. So we were able to take a virtual campus tour, which we had created, and we put that behind the wall after we did our first live stream, which was run by a student from admissions. And we literally walked around the campus. We had maybe 50 or 60 people who viewed it the first time around, but it's been viewed more than 500 times in the last year that we've done it. And those are people, and you can see the metrics, who stayed engaged with it. And then, of course, there's a call to action at the end. If you want to find out more, make sure to come back to campus when campus was open, which it is now. If you want to support students in our College of Science and Liberal Arts, in the newer College of Engineering, this is how you can do that. So you can really customize so much of that, but it requires a lot of constant adjustment. There is no one hard and set rule because different groups, different audiences have different demands. And because the times change, now that we're not out of COVID, but now that there's a lot more physical happening, we need to balance against that again and figure out what goes beyond there. So as you mentioned, mentorships, internships, and so on, specifically for alumni, not so much internships, but job postings for alums. Those are all things we do track, and we verify that they're alums in order to be able to do it. So there's an understanding, I think, with each audience of what the expectations are vis-a-vis their interest and what the college or university or high school can provide. A lot of it is just a judgment call. So we do that on an annual basis. And again, you can only measure that against the success of what you're able to track. So that's what allows us to make decisions based about that.
Great. And so essentially that prioritization framework is centered around what, how these people are responding to the metrics that you're tracking. And then that's how your plan forms for the next year going forward. Right? That's an interesting way to look at it. And Barney, I know that you brought a very different perspective for looking at prioritization based on resource allocation, right? So you mentioned a dimension of prioritization for Vanderbilt was based on where you need to allocate resources. And I know that's true for all of us in different degrees, right? But could you tell us a little bit more about this model that you've been using? You mentioned an A, B, C, D kind of model for prioritizing resources across your team, right? Based on the metrics that you're measuring. Could you talk to us a little about that?
Yeah, sure. I'm just jealous because Michael has the data. We don't have the data yet.
You and me both.
Yeah, right?
So, I could
I wish you could share. Yeah, so for us, we're creating this new plan called Commodore Engagement. And at the end of the day, when we add everybody up, all of our constituents, we've got about 198,000 people. So, and, you know, tell me a shop in North America that has too many staff, right? We'll never have enough. No one does. We engage, you know, almost practically thousands of volunteers, and we still don't have enough, right? So it's really, for us, it's about, okay, who's going to have the highest impact? And when we look at it from, so we have like A, B, C, D, the very top, it's in the model, it's 1%, but really it's about 0.2%. And it's the people who are very, have either a huge social footprint and can really do a lot for us with their time and their talent, and or they're doing their time, talent, and treasure, or they're just doing treasure and not the talent, but whatever, the people who have a really high impact. And so that's where we are, focusing, like I think it's got 10% of our staff time into that small group of people, because we know they have a huge ripple effect. The next group, is about, I think, I don't have in front of me, it's like 3% or something. It's still very small. And those are our like our reunion, leaders, and our super engaged, our class agents, and our folks that really do a ton. And our Oak Leaf Society members, people who give constantly and consistently and are just, those fabulous, loyal people who really enable us to raise a lot of money. So, and then we go to C, and that's sort of our big bulk. That's going to be probably 20-25%. And that's where we're going to put about, I think in the numbers, it's like 50% of our staff time. And that's our big programming, the 10,000 people who came to events back in the day, if we ever remember the live event days, things like that. So that's what we want to deliver, that personalized approach, and really engage folks. And then, show me I've seen a lot of programs, and you look at some of the best programs in the world, and there's always 20 or 25% of the people who are just not going to engage, no matter what you do. You're never going to have much to measure other than maybe opening an email. So that's what we call mass customization. And that's where we're really leaning on technology to, again, deliver hopefully an Amazon-like personal experience to those folks. And that will hopefully up their engagement, but there's always going to be a bunch we're never going to get. So that's maybe 20% of our staff time. So, we're looking at this model and how we do it as we, develop and able to get the data. And we have, see what the outcomes are, the outcome metrics, et cetera. We will see, how we will hopefully pull them up from the bottom, and our 0.2% will be 3% in 2 years, and 4%, 0.4%, right, will slowly increase. But we're going to pull people up our pyramid, but we also are going to see in our data as people come down, life changes, things happen. They have babies, they do things, they leave to other countries, so people come and go. And so we also want to track that and be able to measure that. So that's sort of thing, so we're not spreading the peanut butter evenly over the toast, shall we say. Some are getting a little more than others. So but we'll see. It's all a big experiment.
Got it. And I think the parallels to a conventional sales funnel are interesting, right? Because you're essentially looking at the sections of that funnel and what moves in and out through those sections, and you're trying to adopt that here. And what I find really interesting is how you're trying to integrate the whole piece, right? Like rather than looking at different constituent groups and building programs around that. And I'm really excited to see how all of this pans out, Barney. So, I'll
let you know if I have a job in 2 years.
Awesome. So one of the things I wanted to talk about from the Alma-based side of this is what we call verifications, right? And because Michael mentioned this, right? The problem also with putting a gate is that there's friction for people to get past that gate, and people don't often do that. And it's funny that we're saying this because, for a few years, we were primarily one of those community platforms where you need to come and sign up to engage, right? And the reason was that once you sign up, you're able to identify who you are. But like you said, too much friction, right? So I think the industry as a whole, and not just the alumni industry, just communities, is moving towards trying to put these gates without necessarily having signups or passwords, right? Nobody remembers a password for an alumni network they signed up 2 years ago, right? So that's what we're also seeing here, where you are in essence able to set gates and say that, hey, this is accessible to alumni, or this is accessible only to board members, or maybe this is accessible only to staff. And to get access, the only thing they need to give is their email. We'll look up the record to see if this is actually an alumnus. And you get just like an OTP on your email that you can confirm with, right? So no need to remember a password. You give us your email and we make sure you're an alumnus. And we're seeing that the friction is reducing for this. Of course, a lot of this is new, right? Like people are still getting used to this, but we also believe that this is the direction that the online community space is heading in, like passwordless. But gates are necessary because the people running the communities need to measure, right? So moving on, I think the last bit about this was how exactly are we using these metrics, right? We spoke about how what metrics we measure, and we spoke about also how we prioritize within those metrics, right? Now that we have them, how do we take action based on these metrics, right? Mike, you mentioned KPIs in the beginning of the conversation about how you're using KPIs to measure progress towards your strategic objectives, right? Can you give us an example of this in practice?
Yeah, well, we're still, finalizing our strategic plan. We're developing the KPIs on how we're going to measure that, and that's critical. I mean, obviously, we've spent a lot of time to develop, this strategic plan. The board will ratify this strategic plan in a month, and so, once that is ratified and we move forward, we need to make sure that we have strong KPIs to measure the success of what it is that we're trying to do. With that being said, we measure internally in the department. We have what we call our Padre Fund or our annual fund. So, we look at a lot of different data to measure the success of that program each and every year, which is, part of that is not only the portion of the alumni giving, but it also includes, what we call our annual parent pledge. So that is tracked by our annual fund director. We have a number of different events, our 24-hour day of giving, which we work in conjunction with Alumni Way. So I'm giving you guys your plug on that right now. We have measurement tools that we use to, see how well we do against the number of alumni who, participated the last year. What are our goals going to be for those alumni who participate, in this upcoming event in November? We're hard at work at already doing that. But another thing, I touched on it, one of the things that's relatively new that we're measuring right now is, in regards to alumni engagement. I talked about the speaker series. One of the things that we had talked about internally for a while was, we wanted to do this. We wanted to take advantage of the talents of so many of our alumni. And, it was one of those things, okay, if we want to do it, we have to do it and we have to set it up. So we set a goal to get it set up by October 1st. We wanted to showcase those alums who were doing great things, have them share their stories, as I said, with students. We actually have a design-led innovation class that has become extremely popular, but we also wanted these alums to connect and share their stories with other alums. So, we worked closely with the alumni director. We set a goal to have at least 10 potential alumni speakers ready to go by September 15th, which we were able to do. It allowed our alumni director to engage with more alums and ask them to contribute, their talent back to Sarah, but most importantly, continue to build the relationships with the schools. So that has been something that has been extremely well received. And, those are some of the things that we're doing just to kind of, measure that engagement towards, goals within the department right now, as we look to develop those, measurements, KPIs against our strategic plan, which, again, as I said, hopefully will be ratified here in the next month, and we can move forward with that.
Perfect. And I think that's a great example, especially for some of the smaller organizations, right? You don't necessarily have to have everything in place before you start on a metrics program. Like the speaker series is a small actionable program that you could build around. And like Mike said, right, there's significant impact to several areas as a result of the engagement that's happening through the speaker series, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be large steps, right? You could take small steps with specific programs, and it's all about tying the impact of that program to the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, right? And,
yeah, I was just going to add, I mean, it's easy to talk about and say, hey, we're about to do these things, and we're waiting for the strategic plan to be ratified. I want to make it clear that, we do have goals and measurements that we have against, a number of different areas in the department. But the big thing is, that I would say to people on this panel, especially at smaller institutions, would be just get things started. It may not be perfect, but get things started and start measuring in different areas, because that's going to give you the data that you need to say, is this working? Is it not working? And as you continue to refine that, you'll understand different and better ways to continue to engage and track your constituents.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Michael, I think you're in the enviable position, at least among the people here, of actually having a lot of data to act on. So how do you visualize this, right? Like, tell us about a little about the techniques you use to try and capture and visualize this data so that you can act on it.
So this is all related. And I love what Mike just said, which is you got to start somewhere, right? So you start putting this stuff together, you start tracking it. And then what I've found over many years is if you're not showing it to your boss, or if you're not showing it to your volunteer board, if you're not showing it internally in some visually presentable way, then it's almost like it kind of goes out the window, right? Because we can talk about numbers all day, even if it makes sense, but you need to be able to tie these things together in a way that people can digest relatively quickly and easily. So the question you just asked is a great one. It's one of my favorite things. When I used to work at Kean University many, many years ago, it's a state university in New Jersey, I took all of our alumni data and I converted it into these GIS coordinates. And then I imported that into a Google Earth. And it was the first time I was able to do something like that. The software just didn't exist before that. What I was able to do was then actually literally zoom in, and you would see who was who and where was where and what their houses looked like and what they were doing. And it was the niftiest thing. And it was totally geeky, and no one else knew what in God's name I was doing. And I kept thinking, man, this is so exciting. I'd love to do something with this. Well, it took me many years to try and do something with that, right? So what struck me was being able to zoom in on somebody's house is really just an example of personalizing information in a way that's actually functional and usable. Because it's much easier for somebody to say, oh, I know this person, or I know their class, or I've been there before. I go to a restaurant right around the corner, than it is to say, okay, here's my data and here's, telling me what's what. So here at NJIT over the last year or so, I have had an enormous benefit from our data and operations office that has someone devoted to data analytics. What we're able to do is in two ways. One, reflective of what Barney was talking about, we have, it's essentially based on the Net Promoter Score, but we have the buckets of, champions, acquaintances, and so on, friends, and the motion and the movement of that. So we use Razor's Edge, we use NXT, and NXT has some plugins that let you do that, but you have to create the automation of that. You have to identify the metrics that are going to feed into that. And then what we found was, in order to really get the sort of visualization we want, the staff member I work with, Katura is her name, shout out Katura. She uses Power BI, Microsoft's Power BI. You could also use products like Tableau or something relating to that, which has both importable data sets that you can put in, but also has overlays of public information. So one example is you could take your list of donors, you can put it into something like Power BI or Tableau, and then you can say, where are the highest income zip codes in the country? And this is something you could do on a personal level. This is something anybody in a high school could do, anybody in a grade school could do, like that. And you could say, okay, here, I see it, I get it, now I know. And you can keep overlaying that data to create more and more usability. One of the great things about the viability of software now that we did not have years ago when this all started happening is, first up, there's a proliferation of online tools that can help you. Although you need to be careful, you need to make sure you're observing privacy rules, data rules, and all those things. But secondly, you could do this through Excel. So the newest version of Excel has great data visualization tools. And that is automating. Finally, we're getting to that point where it's automating things that used to take days, weeks, months to do. You could do it in seconds. Now, some of the more advanced stuff, the data visualization, you do need knowledge of data, and you need some programming knowledge possibly, but not all of it. Actually, quite a bit of it you can do today. If you wanted to drop stuff into Excel, you'd be amazed. Go take a look and see what Excel does for you. So with that in mind, those are things that that are available now to pretty much everybody, and I would definitely encourage you to try. And that Google Earth thing, by the way, most of the systems still do that. I took a video of that for our trustees when I first came on board on NJIT. I zoomed into one of their houses, and it was the simplest thing. It was so silly, but they loved it. Oh my goodness, I can't believe we can do this. Any of us could have done that at any time. So fun little things, but it just makes the eye pop.
Exactly. And technology is sort of evolving to a point where some of these things that we can do today, it just seems like magic in some sense, right? And like you said, at the end of the day, it's about making your eyes pop. And Barney, what are you seeing on your end of things, right? Can you talk to us about the intersection of metrics and technology and how what that has meant for you?
Well, very much like what Michael was saying, it's been, I've sort of always been curious about this, and it's always had a large return on investment to do that. Just because my whole mantra is always like, how do we get out of the middle? Like, we're never have enough people, like I mentioned earlier. Like, we have to get out of the middle, we have to scale things. And that's an issue we're dealing with here. So our whole new strategy is very, very technology focused. Like, we don't have a mentoring program across campus. Well, we need something that can allow us to scale that, et cetera. So, the intersection really, comes all over the place, but I really look at it like, what's useful to your constituents to improve their experience. And if we make it sticky, if we make it good, if we make it intuitive and sort of, iPhone friendly, my sort of mantra is 2 clicks, then, and we see the metrics to measure that and the metrics for outputs and outcomes, we can really, all boats rise. For the connection with our team and, directly in our little world, it's all about scalability. It's all about, us to monitor programs. And because we have all these good ideas and they sound great when you develop the plan, et cetera. But a year later, you may find when you do the analysis using your metrics or using your data, that it sucked. That you put all the staff time in and you had very little, outcome. I always tell the story when we did a great expansion one school I was at of, our alumni weekend. We made it a week. We put so much effort into it. And then we had this little book club thing. I was like, oh, that seems like a lot of time, a lot of effort for, 40 people. Well, when we actually did the analysis of alumni engagement points per dollar spent and per staff hour spent, book club was like 10,000 times better return on investment than all of alumni weekend. It's hilarious. So you really need to be able to make data-driven decisions. The other piece is what's good for your institution. How do you, bring the metrics and the technology to the table to be able to lift, again, bring those outcomes to lift your institutional mission and do the things that are important. And to me, a great, opportunity for that, and something we're in the middle of trying to figure out, are dual goal campaigns. So we're doing a large, we're just getting ready, as everyone is always getting ready, for another campaign. Large dollar goal, but like many of the other institutions I've been at, we're going to do it with, hopefully do it with an engagement goal. And that can really show the return, and the impact. And it boils down to very simple numbers that the board of trusts see, that the deans see. And at the end of the day, the deans will see, here's your dollar goal per quarter and how you're doing against goal. And here's your engagement score against goal and how are you doing. And that is like the top of the pyramid of all of our metrics and all of the technology that allows us to get the metrics, do all the stuff underneath it. So it's very simple at the top, but there's it's an iceberg. There's a ton underneath the water, but it's very effective. And so I just see it as like infused in everything we do. It has to be, but it's, again, not easy.
Exactly, and doing it at scale is what makes this whole thing so complicated, right? And I think that's where technology is starting to play more of a leading role, especially over the last 3 to 4 years.
Yeah.
Which incidentally is a good segue into the last thing that I wanted to talk about. Just concluding thoughts from all of you, right? Like, what do you think is going to happen in the next 2 years, right, with technology, and what does this mean for us, right? Especially with Apple putting so much more of a focus on privacy, right, and GDPR coming into effect more strictly across the world, really, and so much is changing that puts a consumer at the center, and that has impact on how we approach outreach, right? But just concluding thoughts on what you guys think might happen in the next 2 years and what that might mean for us. Mike, let's start with you.
Well, for me, I mean, again, from a smaller institution, a high school, I'm actually excited because, the name of the game, it's about relationships. And while, it's not always easy to pick up a phone and just call somebody, the more information you have, I mean, technology has been so helpful, and you can get so much information. There's so many different ways in which you can, connect with an individual these days. At the end of the day, for me, it comes down to, how do I build those relationships and use the technology that we have at hand? So I'm excited. I think that, we've adapted it. I walked into a space that was very much, this is the way we do it, and this is the way we've been doing it. And, very quickly, we decided that in order for us to be successful, we can't continue to do it the way that it's been done in the past. So we're incorporating, a lot of those things. That's why, KPIs to measure success and failure are critical to us going forward. So for me, I'm personally excited about our future. I think we've made positive steps in our engagement with alumni and the way that we've talked to our other constituents and engage them in what it is that we're doing here. So I'm looking forward to taking on the new technology and making sure that our department is up to speed and we can do the things that we need to do to be successful moving forward.
Michael, how do things look from your perspective?
So I love this question because I love, 5 years, 10 years down the road. And one of the great things about alumni development professionals, you've got to be thinking generationally, right? All the software and everything, these are just tools to do a thing. And that thing is to engage people meaningfully with their alma mater, with each other. And that is, to Mike's point, to what Barney was saying, relationships are still the most important thing. And people who build up that trust are the most important part. But if you look at some of the trends that are out there right now, first off, I see that there will be a mass simplification of this data process. Right now, we just came off about 7 years of this explosion of data and trackability. Now we've got a lot of companies that are starting to find ways to manage that and turn it into something. So we're about to see a vast change in the visualization of data and in the ability to turn that into something usable. And AlmaBase is a good example of that. That's going to continue. We're going to see some merging of some smaller companies that turn into things that are more dominant in the field. And I think that's going to be helpful largely to smaller institutions that don't have the time and the resources to invest in doing it themselves. There's also, again, you're never going to see a decrease in the amount of data that's available. That's only going to increase from now on. You're going to start seeing new staff positions. Yes, at colleges and universities, but also at high schools that are going to be much more focused on, right now it's kind of a crossover between business analyst and data analyst, but eventually that is going to become a standard position because it is so necessary to move forward. You are going to see some dramatic switches in what gets tracked. So for instance, one of the things I know I was mentioning briefly with some of our panelists and Jason, you and Kellyanne and I have talked about, Apple is really strongly pursuing privacy regulations. GDPR is part of that, but it's not the only thing. So they're working on automatically disabling click tracking in emails and open tracking. When Apple decides to do something, the industry shakes. So if we're a year or two away from Apple saying, hey, you can't track email opens anymore, or it's so meaningless because we're going to default that it's a yes, that's going to blow up a huge analytics industry. So that's something all of us here should be thinking about. And I think the alternative there is probably twofold. Okay, hey, emails are going to go one way or the other. There's going to be some negotiation with Apple about things like that. But so much the more important that we have other sources of data tracking. That is where online communities are very important. And that is where our actual tracking of things like mentorship, internships, speaking opportunities becomes important. That's separate from emails. As an industry, we're so reliant on emails to tell us yes or no because the data was there for the longest time. And you could figure out who was who. We got to get ourselves out of that habit. And I think, some places are by expanding it, but assume that that's something that's eventually going to go away or dramatically change. Finally, one of the things that I'm actually thrilled by, and again, it's to Mike's point, I actually think this is going to increase a demand for volunteers and really meaningfully engaging volunteers in real volunteer roles. So instead of, for a long time, it was kind of like, well, do we really need volunteers? Do you need an alumni board? Do you need this? Do you need that? We know we can go out and do it. And that happened for about the last 15 years or so. because things got very centered in the university or the college or the high school. Now we're coming back around to a point where we're saying, oh man, data is only so helpful. We really do need volunteer leaders, and we need them in new and unique ways that are not just plan a reunion or attend, join a committee, but are real tangible modes of outreach. And we can empower them to help us in ways we couldn't do before. So, it's not all staff-centered. In fact, it can't be, because we won't be successful if we don't have a legion of good volunteers. Barney, it sounds like he's got a tremendous amount of really great volunteers. Now, I envy that. And when you motivate people, they will help you engage more than any group of staff members ever can. So I think this is actually helping us move in that direction. I think that's great, because that is relationships, and that's what we're here to do fundamentally.
Exactly, and you're essentially the industries are going through a shift from being centered around what we can do to what the constituent needs, right? What the alumni needs. So centered around the alumni, or centered around the constituent, rather than around our office. And I think all of this is just steps in that direction, right? And Barney, and everyone attending, I know we're a little over time, but if you hang around for another 5 minutes, I think we should be able to wrap up. So Barney, I'd love to hear your vantage point on this, especially since your constituent centricity is at the center of a lot of the things that you're doing, right? Keeping that in mind, what do you think will happen in the next 2 years, and what that might mean for us?
There's a lot going on. I totally agree with a lot of what's been said. And I think a couple of interesting things. One is that there is so much technology coming out that is constituent centric, that actually I think will allow organizations of all sizes to do this. Price points coming down, Salesforce and other teams or software are enabling us to be much more, I call it sort of Lego. We can plug and play a lot easily. We're not locked into legacy systems in the same way we were historically. So I think that's really exciting. And I think that gets us closer if we can knit all this together again, using the user experience, like Michael's talking about new types of staff. Like I desperately want a digital strategist. I desperately want a user experience person who that's all they think about 24/7. To be able to knit things together in a way that we actually start to meet our constituents' expectations. One of the biggest drivers of our new strategy is there's a huge gulf between our constituents, where they're at and experiencing the world with Amazon and everything we all experience, versus what we're delivering. And we're sort of rocking the early 2000s. We've got a gap to close here. So I think that's really important. Also, I think what's going to bite us and is coming up is a real big focus on, as you mentioned, focusing on privacy, but also the ethical use of artificial intelligence. How do we let people know what we're doing, how we're doing it, why we're doing social listening, et cetera. And then, the last thing I think is also very interesting is, my last point is the interface of people and technology. We have a project we've experimented with. We call them engagement officers. And we use technology to enable our engagement officers. We have 3 of them. They're all very young, very bright, and very, very personable. And they're fresh out of school pretty much. And they use technology such as Hustle and other things where they can scale and send 400 emails that are personal email to 400 people all at once. And as those people respond, or text, they then get into a personal conversation with this engagement officer. And we're seeing some really good results of that. So we've had over 8,000 personal touch points in the last 4 months. And it's really interesting. So it's almost like that cyborg sort of technology meets people thing. And it's very cool and allows for scalability and allows to, I think, drive a better customer experience. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that type of stuff in the future. But I know we're at time, so awesome. Thank you all.
Awesome.
I love thinking about this stuff.
Thank you. And I really love the perspective that all of you have brought. And and that's what we started with, right? Let's focus on the similarities that we have rather than on the differences, and we grow as an industry. And it's exciting times, right? So much is changing and technology is exponentially growing. And let's all just help each other out and stay on top of this, right? So that's what all this is about. One last bit before we close, we're trying to do this more regularly, where we're bringing together industry experts to talk about the things that we need to talk about. The next panel discussion that we're hosting is about an alumni-centric approach to transforming philanthropy, right? Broad spectrum. And we've got great panelists, both Dr. Maria Gallo and Dr. Kevin Fleming have done doctorates and postdoctorates in higher education, and Maria actually wrote a book recently called The Alumni Way that just came out a couple of days ago, I think. I'd love it if all of you attending could join us for this conversation as well. You can scan this code to register. I'll just drop in a link to registration on the chat as well in case you want to go ahead and register through that. But this is coming up. Just want to let you guys know. That apart, it's been a super interesting conversation, guys. I really appreciate all three of you, Barney, Mike, and Michael, for taking time out from your schedules today and just talk about your perspectives to this. I'm sure it's been really useful for a lot of the people that have been attending as well. If you have questions, I know we're out of time, but if you can drop it in chat or you can reach out to us on email, we'll try and connect the dots to help you out with the questions you have, right? So feel free to reach out to any of us and let's just keep the conversation growing. And really, thank you so much for joining us today. And it was a pleasure hosting you all.
Awesome.
Thank you, Jishan.
So
Thank
much.
you.
Very
Thank
fun.
you. Nice to meet you, Barney. Nice to meet you, Michael. Good luck.
Yeah, great
See you,
to,
Mike, Barney as
great to
well.
hear you guys. I learned a lot. It was
Thank you.
awesome.
Yeah, me too.
Take care,
I
everyone.
like that hustle. Bye, everybody.
Yeah, hustle's cool. Good
See you guys.
platform.
How's what
All right.
keeps us going, right? All right. See you guys.
Thanks again. That was good job putting it together and managing
you.
it. That's a lot.
Thank you.